Hi there. This video is going to be covering the cultural trigger word of the N word, also kind of giving some reasons why I still teach Their Eyes Were Watching God, and what I'm going to be kind of expecting when it comes to the use of the N word in our class and in the text. So, this presentation is going to be a little bit on the wordier side. Most of it is good for pausing if you want to look at it, but I'm going to be kind of breezing through some of this stuff. What we're going to be doing is defining our trigger words and making sure that we identify what I'll be using for this trigger word and how I expect us to approach it. So, we are going to be teaching Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I find it to be one of my favorite books of all time. But there is the hateful and racist word of the N word. It is used from one Black character to another, so white characters aren't generally going to be using the N word. And so, in terms of the usage, it is an in-group use of the N word. However, I want to make sure that we understand how we're going to use it in our classroom. And I just want to make sure that you understand why we're still providing this text, even when there is the use of this word. So when people from the Black Student Union and people of color clubs around school district uh, have formed, they wanted to make sure that there was some kind of basic understanding, basic pretext to whatever it is we're learning. And so want to make sure that when teachers use the N word in a text, like in English, that we talk about the purpose of it. And so I am going to be talking about the use of the N word and also why we're not going to be reading it out loud in class. This presentation is going to give you context about what the text is about. It's also going to give you some context about when it was written. It was written by a particular author, and I'm not going to give you the unit objectives and goals, although I'm happy to do that. I just don't want this video to take forever, so I'm happy to provide those objectives and goals for you if you need that. I'm more or less going to be talking about why it's important to still use the text in spite of the N word. So here's some biographical information. I have taken this information from this amazing writer, TEWWG Fraser, and she wrote this book of what Their Eyes Were Watching God taught her about life, love, and writing. So I've taken it from her article. So Zora Neale Hurston is the author. She was born on January 7th in 1891. This is after the Civil War ended. So this is after slavery ended, but during the emergence of the Jim Crow laws. She was born in Alabama, but she was raised in Florida. So she essentially grew up in the South, and there is definitely a culture of racism that was already there because of slavery and because of agricultural systems that were put in place. There was a lot of sharecropping happening at this time, and sharecropping is when it was essentially a systemic form of racism without beating people or oppressing them and shackling them. So it was definitely a form of slavery that this author had been raised in. And she decided to go to Howard University, which is a Black university in Washington, D.C., where she earned a degree in 1920. And that is right about the time where World War II ended and where we had the Roaring Twenties, when the United States was at the height of its greatest economic power after World War I. Miss Hurston, she earned a BA degree in anthropology, which is the study of people groups, and she did that in 1928. So if you know anything about history, this is right about the time where the stock market crashes and the United States goes into a massive depression. So Miss Hurston, in the 1930s, specifically 1937, gets a fellowship, a study to study in Haiti, where she writes Their Eyes Were Watching God in 7 weeks, published in the same year. So it's really quite impressive that she was able to not only study professionally at that time in Haiti, but she also wrote this really beautiful book. So why do we teach Their Eyes Were Watching God? We teach it because I teach it because of the authenticity of voice and the poetry of storytelling. This is written from the perspective of a Black woman about a Black woman. It is gorgeously written. It's very authentic in terms of what was written, especially at the time, but also just how beautifully it was written. She wrote what she knew. So she wrote the voice of Southern Black Floridians. She wrote in a way that was poetic but also authentic. So on page 10, she writes about this character, Janie, and how Janie is a young woman who is coming into her own as a, beautiful young woman. And so she creates this metaphor for her as in a flower. From barren brown stems to glistening leaf buds, from the leaf buds to snowy virginity of bloom, the rose of the world was breathing out smell. It followed her through all of her waking moments and caressed her in her sleep. This idea of Janie growing into a beautiful young woman is a metaphor, metaphorically from this idea of flowers blooming. So Hurston not only is writing about a woman who is growing up the same age as approximately you are, but also she's adding this beautiful layer of figurative language. She also wrote in complex vernacular and engaging Southern dialect, which is another way of saying how they sound, is how she wrote it. So she didn't write in straight English, she actually wrote in this Southern dialect. I'm going to read this to you, and you can hear how she writes out how this actual dialect sounds. When I wasn't in the store, he wanted me to just sit with folded hands and sit there. And I'd sit there with the walls creeping up on me and squeezing all the life out of me. This isn't written in straight English because she didn't grow up around straight English. And so, in the way that we're going to talk about in another video that I'm showing, the Southern dialect is authentic and beautifully written. I also want to show you how the themes are quite relatable as you are growing up in your own world, how Janie can teach you a lot through her own journey. So one of the themes is knowing yourself. So one of the things that is prominent is the minute that you allow other people to limit you, you diminish yourself and your potential. When someone says you can't, or you shouldn't, or you won't, then all of a sudden, if someone believes it, they start to really act that out. Janie discovers that her inner guidance is way more powerful than the naysayers that are outside of her telling her that she can't, or that she shouldn't, or that she won't. And so she, through a lot of trials, comes to live life on her own terms. Even if no one else agreed with her, she came to live her own life. And when she lived her own life, she had hardships. She had a really hard life. But every single life hardship created a lesson, and she became truer to who she was. She grew and she learned, much like you will in your life. And also, I really like how this book celebrates gender equality and celebration of Black Southern culture. Janie lived in a time where it was not an equal partnership of men and women, and there were certainly non-binary people. There were none that were being identified at the time. If they were, they hid in the folds of society. And so she actually um, was celebrating her own independence in this text, even when it was not okay. So, in that way, I use feminist as a celebration of equality, not a political statement that some might take, but as an opportunity to really come to her own as a woman. And it was also a celebration of Black Southern culture because not only was she a woman who had her own thoughts and ideas, she was a Black Southern woman who went out and became her own agent of joy and worth. So, in that way, this is why I show this text. I read this text with you because it is such a powerful story of power, preservation, and individuality. However, there is still the use of the N word. So I don't want to dismiss this lesson without going over it. But I am a white woman, and therefore I don't feel comfortable telling anybody about the use of the N word. And so I'm actually going to be using this YouTube um, uh, uh, content creator named Chelsea Lee, and she does this really great bit on the use of the N word. So it's about 5 minutes long. I'm going to end the video with her, but I will reiterate what she's talking about and then how we will use the N word in our class.
But most recently, the conversations come to light again after Madonna got into some hot water when she posted a photo on Instagram of her son and captioned it with the N-word. Now, this is not the first time that this has happened. Of course, we remember Gwyneth Paltrow and the infamous Paula Deen. And every time the conversation of a non-Black person using the N-word comes up, there are some common questions and misunderstandings associated with it. So I wanted to break them down and give you my perspective. A little disclaimer, I do not speak for all Black people. This is just based on my personal opinion and my life experience. So if you are not a Black person and you use the N-word, I don't care if it ends in an ER or an A, chances are you're going to face some sort of backlash. And usually the excuse that I've encountered offline and on starts with, well, the N-word's not really a racial slur. It doesn't mean Black people. It means stupid. That is absolutely incorrect. The N-word comes from the Spanish and Portuguese word for Black, negro. So how do you take a completely benign word, the word for Black, and make it into a slur? Well, you have to look at the word's historical context. The N-word was used to describe Black people as they were being stolen from Africa, put into slavery, chained, lynched, raped, beaten, spit upon. So the word was created as a tool of oppression. Its historical context cannot be erased. Who is allowed to say it? In reality, everyone is allowed to say whatever it is that they want to say, but there will always be consequences for your words and your actions. So depending on who you are and where you are, there will be different consequences for what you say and do. And this is not something that's just related to the N-word or was just specifically created for this word. This is a regular occurrence. It's a matter of in-group versus out-group dynamics. So when you're a member of a certain group, there are things that are totally okay and socially acceptable when you're in that group. And for people outside of that group, you give them the side eye and it's just not okay. For example, for some reason, football players pat each other on the butt as a way to say, like, good job. And no one thinks twice about it. It's totally okay. But as soon as that football player steps off the field, if some random stranger walked up to them and started petting them on the butt, they would not be okay with it. Whoa, dude, who are you? Why are you patting my butt? We're not playing football. You're not a football player. This is weird. Something else I've encountered when it comes to talking about the N-word is the common idea that if you guys don't want people to say it, then you should stop saying it. I actually heard this most recently when I spoke at a college from one of the students at my talk, and it was just like, all Black people don't do the same things or act the same way or use the same language. Personally, I don't use the N-word, and I'm not going to begrudge anyone else that does it because you can talk about yourself however you want to. And there are some people that really believe that using the N-word is a way to reclaim it. It's like an act of defiance. You know, you have used this horrible word to oppress me and keep me down, so I'm going to turn it around and change its meaning into something else. Furthermore, all Black people are not tapped into some hotline. There's not a number that I can call and make decisions about what we should all do. Like, I can't call up Kendrick Lamar and be like, hey, Kendrick, I love Mad City, but you use the N-word way too much and it's making us look bad. P.S. You got robbed at the Grammys. That's not an option. And so, no. But the thing that bothers me the most is when people argue that it's just not fair. It's a double standard that Black people can use the N-word and everyone else can't. The reason this bothers me so much is it's completely self-serving and disingenuous. These people do not care about fairness or any of the disparities that Black people in this country and around the world face, because if they did, they wouldn't be arguing over the use of the N-word. Instead, they'd focus on real problems like job discrimination, housing discrimination, racial profiling, police brutality, the school-to-prison pipeline, stop and frisk, the harsher prison sentences that Black people and other minorities face. They would rather argue that it's not fair that there are social consequences for people that aren't Black who use the N-word. Priorities. You has them.
So I am not going to celebrate the N-word. I'm not going to have us read it out. We're not going to actually talk about it, but it is going to exist in the text. And so in the way that Chelsea Lee uses the N word as an in group. That's exactly what it is. It's an in group use of the word in the text. And so, therefore, it is there, it is present, it is part of their culture, but we are not going to do anything with that word. It's essentially just going to exist as part of a sentence. And so, I understand that it may be an offensive word. I am more than happy and willing to talk to you about the use of the word, but in our classroom, we are not going to use that word in any shape or form. And the idea behind it is just to kind of address it, to identify that it is there, but also to understand that the importance of the text is about the themes. It's about the text, the theme of the text, not the use of the N word. If you have any questions, I'm happy to address them. I'm happy to talk to you about it. Thank you for listening to my really long-winded video. I hope that this was helpful on some level, and I very much look forward to reading this book with you. Thank you.